Well, hello there, everybody. Jacob Burton here from StellaCulinary.com, and today we'll be discussing how to choose a proper cooking technique. And a question that I get quite often is, how do I know what cooking technique to use and when? And being able to understand and answer this question for yourself is extremely important, because no matter how well executed a given technique is, if you're applying that technique to the inappropriate product in the first place, then you're going to get negative results, no matter how good you are. So to understand first how to apply cooking techniques or how to choose a cooking technique, you must first understand the product. And fruits and vegetables are fairly straightforward. You can watch our whole kitchen prep series. We have a lot of different video techniques on how to prep vegetables. But for the most part, you're peeling and blanching. It's not a big deal. What really throws people for a loop is animal anatomy. And here we have a cow, and we're going to be discussing the different cuts of the animal, just real briefly, just enough to give us a foundation for choosing an appropriate cooking technique. Because when you go to the store, when you purchase a protein, when you purchase a piece of meat, the first question that you need to ask yourself when planning to apply a cooking method is this a tough cut or a tender cut? And the answer to that question will dictate the final cooking technique that you apply. So the tough cuts of meats come from the extremities of the animal. The farther out towards the surface of the animal that you get, generally speaking, the more tough those cuts are. So in the front portion here of the animal, of the cow, you have the chuck and the brisket and the shank. The chuck is where you get things like your short rib and your pot roast. Very flavorful, but if cooked improperly, can become extremely chewy. Also your brisket, where of course you're getting your barbecue brisket, corned beef. Your shank, if you cross-cut your shank, you're getting osso buco. Again, all very flavorful cuts of meat, but extremely tough if you don't apply the proper cooking technique. Then you have the middle section, or the belly portion, and the belly portion is where you get bacon from a pig. In this case, the flank is where you're cutting things like flank steaks and skirt steaks. So this isn't a super tough region of the animal, but it's not where you get your premium tender cuts either. It's somewhere in between. Then you have the rear of the animal, where the round and some more shanks are. And from that round, you can have the rump roast. But really, what a lot of people are after when they're talking about premium steaks or premium cuts of beef is this middle section right here, this sweet spot. And this is where you're going to fabricate your things like your filet mignons and your New York and your prime rib, your porterhouse, your T-bone. They all come from this area of the animal and are all considered tender cuts of meat, with some being more tender than others, and the most tender being the tenderloin itself. And you'll see right in front of the round, right, which is at the rear of the animal, right in front of the round, below the sirloin and above the top sirloin is the tenderloin. And the tenderloin is prized for its tenderness among steak eaters because it's a very lazy muscle. It doesn't really do much. It just kind of sits there isolated and protected by all these exterior muscles. Now what happens is the more work a muscle has to do, like the legs, like the breast, right? All these muscles are used to move the animal around and to give it mobility. The more that muscle is used, the more strength it must have, and the more structural integrity it must have. And that structural integrity comes from a connective tissue called collagen. And this collagen is what makes your meat super, super chewy. But what happens is if you apply heat and time to this collagen, collagen is really nothing more than a triple helix of gelatin. So what happens is over time, when the appropriate heat is applied, that collagen unravels into its 3 separate strands of gelatin, making that piece of meat that was once super tough and chewy now tender. Now what you want to do is take this knowledge and apply it to your choice of cooking techniques. And the way I like to think of this is I like to draw a square with 4 quadrants in it. And you really have 2 ways of applying heat or temperature. And then you also have 2 ways of applying time. So for applying heat, you can either apply moist heat or you can apply dry heat. Now when applying time, you can either cook it slow or you can cook it fast. Pretty simple, right? And so what happens is every single cooking technique out there is going to fall into one of these 4 quadrants. Any technique that falls into the slow quadrant, and we have 2 slow quadrants, we have the slow and moist and slow and dry, this is going to be reserved for tough cuts of meat, right? And anything that falls into the fast and moist or the fast and dry category, these are going to be your tender cuts of meat. So to put this into perspective, let's start filling out these quadrants. Our moist and slow contains techniques like braising, stewing, and sous vide. And sous vide, you can is kind of its own little magical technique that we'll talk a lot more about in the future. Now, braising, stewing, and sous vide kind of breaks the rule because you can pretty much sous vide just about anything. But braising and stewing in general, you're going to use these techniques for things like short ribs and corned beef, pork butt, lamb shank, ossobuco, all these tough cuts, and you're applying gentle, moist heat over a long period of time. It's breaking that collagen down, unraveling that triple helix of gelatin, and making that cut tender. Now, in the dry and slow quadrant, we have things like roasting, smoking, which is barbecue, right? Confit, which is basically just oil poaching or poaching in fat. And the cuts of meat that you normally would use these techniques for are things like leg of lamb, brisket, duck confit, just barbecue in general. I mean, the whole genre of barbecue, for the most part, is taking tough cuts of meat and then applying smoke at a very low temperature over a long period of time, again, breaking down that collagen and making that tough cut of meat tender and very flavorful. Now, in the fast and moist category, you have boiling and simmering, and boiling and simmering are usually reserved for things like vegetables, especially blanching or root vegetables. You're not going to be seeing a lot of people boil or simmer meats, and if they do, they're not really turning out that well. Steaming again is a very fast-paced, moist cooking method, usually applied to shellfish, things like that. It's anything that has a barrier. You want some sort of barrier when using steam. If you apply the steam directly to meat, for the most part, it's not going to cook that evenly. And then you have poaching, which you can poach a chicken breast, you can poach a piece of fish, but because you're using water and because you're using a tender cut of meat, you're still poaching at a fairly relatively fast pace. I mean, poaching a piece of fish at 160, 180 degrees Fahrenheit only takes 4 to 5 minutes. So the kinds of cuts that you would use for a fast and moist cooking method are your vegetables, which you're going to boil, your fish, which you can poach or steam, and your chicken breast, which you can also poach and steam. And these are just a few examples I'm throwing out here. Now, for the fast and dry methods, you can use roasting and baking, and these are two different techniques, but they're very commonly interchanged, and we'll talk more about this in the future. Grilling, either over gas or hot coals, is a great way to cook a tender cut of meat. Searing, think like an ahi steak or or just a beautiful steak in general, searing at a high temperature. Also sauteing and stir frying. Frying in general, whether you're deep fat frying or you're pan frying, are great for tender cuts of meat. And broiling as well, and broiling is basically upside down grilling. And when you're applying these dry and fast cooking methods, you're going to apply them generally to cuts of meat or various products such as fish. Again, vegetables. Vegetables are great grilled, great roasted, great sautéed. Poultry, you can roast or bake or grill. Steaks, you can broil, grill, all that good stuff. And then, of course, the loin, which the loin of the animal is the most tender region. So you're generally going to use a dry and fast cooking method like grilling, like searing, like sauteing for things like beef tenderloin, pork tenderloin, lamb loin chops, all that good stuff. Now, we will be talking a lot more about these individual cooking techniques in their own videos in the future, but this video was more just to sort of lay out the guide of how you would go about thinking about these cooking techniques and how you would actually choose them. Now, if you're watching this video on the Stella Culinary website or through YouTube, you can click on any one of these video icons and be taken directly to that playlist, whether it be cooking techniques, food science, or the completed dish. And all these video series are also available in iTunes for your downloading pleasure. Also, don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube to make sure that you never miss a new video, which we release weekly. And just click on that subtle subscribe to Stella Culinary on YouTube button and you'll be good to go. We've released over 100 videos now, not to mention hours of audio lectures that can be found on stellaculinary.com. So save your money. Culinary school is now free.